In this lecture, we're going to look at how the history mode can be used to change how URLs work in our application. Currently, we don't have links to navigate around. If we want to test the router properly without links, we'll need to switch the mode. I'll explain what's going on in a moment, but first, let's change the mode. We'll continue working in the router configuration file. We're going to change the import statement to grab the create web hash history function. Then, we'll update the history property to this function. The arguments will remain the same. I'll break down what's going on, but let's see its effects in the app. Back in the browser, refresh the page. Everything's still the same except for the URL. In the address bar, the View Router library has added a hash to the URL. Very mysterious. Let's try testing if the /about path works. Before we do, switch to the network panel. We want to check that the page does not refresh. It shouldn't because the View Router will prevent that. We should be able to switch between pages without having to re-download assets. If there's already logs in the network panel, you can clear it by pressing the Clear button. Without removing the hash, add the word about to the URL. The message inside the About component will appear. The network panel won't log anything new. This means that even though the URL has changed, the page didn't refresh. Instead, the router was able to change the content without having to reload the assets internally. We can view more information about the routes by switching to the View Developer Tools. There's a section called Timeline. On the timeline, we'll be able to view events. The history will provide you with a log of paths that have been accessed in the application. If I were to press the backward or forwards button on the browser, new paths would be logged. This logging capability is one of the benefits of using the View Router. It integrates perfectly with the View Developer Tools. All this information is available to help us debug the application. I can even click on each path to see more details. We won't be diving too deep into this. We'll be exploring it in future lectures. There's another section called Routes. It'll contain a list of routes registered in our app. It'll tell you which route is currently active. You can click on a route to view the details. We won't find much information because we're keeping our routes simple. This tool is a great way to check if your routes were registered successfully without moving around in your application. This is the basics of routing. The minimum requirements for creating a route is to set the path and component. The router will take care of the rest for you. We've covered the basics. Let's talk about the hash you'll find in the address bar. To better understand what this does, I'm going to switch over to Wikipedia. I'm on the page for pizza, but any Wikipedia entry will do. Every Wikipedia page has a list of contents. There are links to sections on the page. If you can click on any of these list items, you'll automatically jump to that section of the page. This is performed with basic HTML. JavaScript is not required to perform this trick. Creating this effect isn't hard to pull off. The first step is to assign an ID to an element. After assigning an ID, you can create a link that points to that element by using a hash. I'm going to scroll back to the list of contents. I'll inspect one of the links. In the Developer Tools, we can clearly see that the href attribute is set to the section's ID. Browsers will interpret this differently than full HTTP URLs. Instead of reloading the page, it'll jump to the section. This is what the View Router is using because jumping to a section doesn't cause the page to refresh. The router will override this behavior by swapping out components. You may be curious as to why the router opts to use the hashing system. This is because the hash system has been around longer than most web APIs. It's a system that even works in legacy browsers. If you're building an application that must work on older browsers, then you may want this behavior. The problem with using hashes is that they don't get indexed by most search engines. Another issue is that users don't commonly type hashes in their address bars. Luckily, A new API was introduced to solve this issue called the History API. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a site that goes over how to use the History API. We don't have to worry about the details of how the History API works, because the router library will take care of it for us. Let's go back to the editor. Previously, we switched the functions around. We're going to change the function back to the Create Web History function. The View router will switch to using the History API. There's another mode available called Memory. This mode is when you want to keep the route changes tracked internally without modifying the URL bar. It's not a common mode to use, but it is available if you ever need it. The History mode will suffice for now. Save your changes and view the browser. Everything will continue to work. Let's try changing the path to something else. The application will continue to render the component associated with the record. This behavior is fine, but there are a couple of things you should be aware of. First is that the page gets reloaded. If we were to view the network panel, clear it out, and then change the path, this would result in a page refresh. This isn't an issue with Vue or even JavaScript. This behavior is how browsers are supposed to behave. Anytime a change is made to the URL in the address, the browser will force a new request. Otherwise, it would be hard to navigate around the web. Previously, when we used hashes, this wasn't the case. It's because browsers are smart enough to know that anything after a hash relates to the content on the page and not some other location. If we want to navigate from page to page without reloading assets, we'll need to add links. That's perfectly fine anyway. Users don't normally browse a site by constantly changing the URL in the address bar. They navigate around by clicking on links. We'll learn how to create links in the next lecture. The very last thing I want to mention is how pages are delivered to the client. Servers will always have priority for handling requests. Vue is a client-side library. It will not run until the application is delivered to the client. Therefore, it's always important to respond with an index.html file regardless of the URL. Just because we make a request to the About page doesn't mean the Vue router will automatically handle it. Servers always get first dibs on stuff like this. After the index file is delivered, our application can take over routing and display the correct content. We don't have to worry about doing that because we're using Vite to create a server. Vite will always serve the index file. If you're using a different backend, then you will need to configure this yourself, or you can have a backend developer handle it. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the History Mode documentation page. As stated on the page, simply changing the mode to History won't automatically make routing work. There are example configurations you can make to the backend to get this to work fully. It depends on what you're using as the server. I'm mentioning this now because you may want to test this on a production server. Things may not work as expected. Just remember to serve the index file so that Vue can handle the routing. I recommend reading the page further if you're curious about how the History API works in Vue.